Hello friends, welcome to CEC Live Lectures. Dear friends, today in this session we are going to continue further in our series on Indian philosophy. Dear friends, through our previous session we are discussing more and more on Nyaya philosophy, and in our previous session we discussed on Nyaya Theory of Perception. Friends, today also we are going to talk on Nyaya Theory of Perception only. We are going to give you in-depth knowledge on the same topic, as there is a lot of more content left for you on this particular topic. Friends, for the discussion on the topic, we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Verma is a prolific professor. Through him, we try to grab maximum knowledge, maximum information in the area of philosophy. Friends, we feel that you might have lots of questions regarding the entire series, this particular lecture too. So while listening to the lecture, if you feel so that you have certain questions which you want to be answered right now, then you can contact us through our toll-free number. Friends, our toll-free number is 1-800-110-430. I repeat, our number is 1-800-110-430. You are just requested to call in the last 10 minutes of the lecture. As well, please ask questions relevant to the topic only. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Ajay Verma, once again, and would request him to explain us in detail Nyaya Theory of Perception. Hello sir, welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Gitika. Hello viewers. So as you are already aware, in this series on Indian philosophy, we have been talking about, we have been having discussions on Nyaya philosophy, and in that particular, under that particular theme, in our last lecture, we had a look at Nyaya Theory of Perception, and there, let's have a quick recapitulation of what we have discussed so far, and then from there onwards we'll continue our discussion further. You would remember that we have discussed how what kind of realism does Nyaya propound and believe in. And as a part of that, we discussed that there could be different kinds of realism. First of all, we must understand that realism is basically an idea which according to which things, objects out there in the world exist independently of our knowledge of them. And the moment we look at the world in this fashion, our theory of perception, the way we look at our perception of the world, that would also be shaped, that would also be influenced by our general metaphysical view of the world. So, say for example, if we believe in the kind of realism that Nyayikas believe in, which is as we have discussed earlier also, which is a kind of naive realism, though it is not it's not beyond all contentions. But certainly, Nyaya realism is not a kind of representational realism, because according to them, perception is a kind of complex phenomena, and it reflects the kind of complexity that an object has. So first of all, their view of the world is somewhat like this. According to them, any objects exist independently of our knowledge of them, and then objects also have certain properties. So and those properties in turn also have particularities and certain kind of generic features, and so on and so forth. So the basic idea that that we are trying to understand here is that perception is a complex phenomena. It's not as simple as it generally seems, because because generally we tend to believe that objects are non-partite, they are individual entities, and they represent themselves as they actually are. They present themselves as they actually are, as the objects are to us, and there is some kind of immediate knowledge of the object that we have. But apart from that, object also has certain kind of complexity about itself. We not only know the object as so and so, but we also are aware of its several properties. So we are aware of not only the object, but we are aware of an object as it is presented to us, along with a certain kind of paraphernalia, which includes its properties, which includes its generic characters, which includes its particularities, and so on and so on, and so on and so forth. And all of them, since we have knowledge of all of them. Say, for example, when we are aware of an object, we are not only aware of what that object is, we are also aware of what color that object is. We are also aware whether it's being colored so and so is something that is essential to it or not. We also know that there is some kind of a generic quality of that color. There is some kind of general property of the object itself, like tableness of the table, cowness of the cow, and so on and so forth. So since when we form prepositions, when we have certain knowledge instances, those knowledge instances have a certain kind of complexity, and we have knowledge of not only the object as a whole, but object as along with the kind of scheme between part and whole, and the kind of relationship that it has with other objects around it. All that is given is given in the perception, along with all the complex structure that that object may have to its the kind of internal complexity it has within itself, and the kind of complex structure that it forms along with the other objects there in the world. So and many of these complexities are subject of perception. They are given within the perceptual content. So and that to explain that is not an easy job from epistemological point of view. So therefore, how we define, what kind of definition of perception we offer, a lot would depend on that, whether how much of different kinds of complexities that are involved in perception, how much of it we can explain through a knowledge of perception. Sort of that would depend on how we define, how we look at the very act of perception. And from that point of view, the definition of perception is very important. And that is why there is a long discussion on the definition of perception as we find it in Nyaya Sutras written by Gautam. There are several commentators who sort of take their own who look at this definition in their own way and try to interpret this definition, keeping in mind certain questions and how those questions could be answered. Now, in our present lecture, we wouldn't be looking at different commentaries, how or if at all, we would be looking at it very briefly. So let's begin then once again with the definition of perception as we find it in Nyaya Sutra. So in Nyaya Sutra, the definition of perception that is given is as follows: Indriyartha sannikarsha utpannam jnanam avyapadeshyam avyabhichari vyavsyatmakam pratyaksham. So, which can be roughly defined as a perceptual cognition arises by means of the connection between sense faculty and object, and further, it is not dependent on words, it is non-deviating, and is determinate. So as we can see from this definition, there are certain qualifications that have to be met in a certain kind of instance of perception before it actually qualifies as a kind of perceptual cognition. And what are those conditions? The central condition, the most essential condition is that it should be indriyartha sannikarsha utpannam, meaning it should be a result of, it should be produced, utpannam, it should be a result of or produced from sannikarsha, meaning concourse of indriya and earth, of the sense organ and the object concerned. Now you would remember that in our previous lecture we have already discussed what we mean by indriyas. We have already talked about the bahya indriyas and the internal sense organ manas. And we have also very briefly discussed what is meant by artha and how the indriyas and artha are conceptualized, are looked at in Nyaya philosophy. So the next very important thing that we need to look at is Nyaya idea of concourse. How indriyas or sense organs come into a concourse, come into some kind of a connection with the object concerned. And as pointed out earlier, object as it is given to us in perception comes along with lots of complexities about it, because it comes along with certain properties, and all the properties are associated with the object in different ways. And therefore, all these properties of the object are given to us in perception also in different ways, which calls for different kinds of concourses. So, say for example, object as a whole is directly available to us for perception. And there could be a direct conjunction between the sense organ and the object. So, as if there's a table lying before me, one could say, well, the table is available to me for perception directly. So, my it is directly in touch with my sense organ. Also, we must understand here that perception, another feature that is pointed out by one of the commentators of Nyaya philosophy, is that perception is also a kind of knowledge which does not require any previous knowledge. So say for example all the other pramanas, say for example anumiti or upamiti, or for that matter verbal authority, all these other kind of pramas generated by other kinds of pramanas, they require some kind of a prior knowledge. So say for example if we talk about anumana, Anumana requires some kind of prior knowledge of invariable concomitance, invariable association between two objects under consideration. One of them is available to us through perception, and the other is inferred on the basis of that perception. So say for example in fire and smoke example, smoke is directly given to us in perception, whereas the fire, where smoke is given to us in perception, and fire is something that we infer, that is not within our visual field but could be inferred on the basis of its invariable association with the smoke. So it requires prior knowledge of this invariable concomitance between the two. Similarly, in Upamiti, it requires prior knowledge of similarity, and of course in Shabda Praman also we require knowledge of word meaning already. Or not only that, we also must have an understanding of semantic conditions that have to be met, syntactical conditions that have to be met, and so on and so forth. Whereas in perception, no such kind of previous knowledge is required. So it's in that way a direct form of knowledge, and this is a point that is emphasized even more in Navya Nyaya philosophy. But now coming back to this old definition, the definition that we find in Prachin Nyaya. As we saw, we have already discussed about what we mean by indriyas, what we mean by artha, and now we would want to look at the next condition, which is sannikarsha. As pointed out, sannikarsha, since object comes along with a kind of a complex structure, so some part, knowledge of some of the features associated with the object, could be directly available to us. But then there are certain other features which are not given to us as directly as, say, for example, the object itself, and that calls for a very different kind of explanation of sense object concourse. So therefore, when we talk about sannikarsha or concourse between the indriyas and the artha and the object, it comes along. This topic comes along with its own complexities in Nyaya philosophy. And apart from that, another thing that we must understand is that not only object comes along with its own kind of structure, its own kind of schematic unity within itself, and its kind of relationship it bears with other objects around it. But also apart from that, our perception, our perceptual proposition, our perceptual judgment that we form inside our mind is at most of the time in excess of what is actually available to us in perception. So, say for example, when we look at the classical example is that of a fragrant flower or fragrant sandalwood. So when we look at a piece of sandalwood, we know that it is we know it to be fragrant as well, even if at the point of perception, at the moment of perception, we may not be actually feeling the smell of that thing. But more common examples would be say for example, if somebody, a person who's known to us, comes before us, we are reminded about a whole lot of things about that person. Another example would be three-dimensionality, and any object is given to us in two dimension, but we know it, we engage with the world as if it had three dimensions. Similarly, when a person who is already known to us comes to us, it's not that we will look at that person as a kind of a package. We know the history, we may know the history of that person, we may know a lot of other things about that person, so which would be responsible for what kind of psychological response would be created in us. Say for example, a person who is known to have done politically horrendous things. Say for example, if Hitler were to be alive today, and if he were present before us, we would get reminded of the kind of actions that he has been responsible for, and it would evoke a particular kind of psychological response in us. So the point here is that when we look at the object, there is a whole psychological side of it. We look at it as a kind of a package, and many a times the kind of phenomenological picture that we form inside our mind is a little bit in excess of what is actually given to us at a particular moment. And to account for that kind of constructionism that is involved in an instance of perceptual cognition, at times the ordinary sense object contact may not be a sufficient explanation. Therefore, as far as sense object concourses are concerned, Nyayikas think of sense object concourse as of to be of two kinds. According to them, there could be certain kinds of sense object concourses which are ordinary in nature. So they are called they are put under the category of logic. So logic means ordinary, this worldly, this is how probably empirical. These are several terms that could be used for what they mean by logic. So in logic perception, we could account for perception of an object or some certain features associated with the object through some kind of ordinary sense object concourse. So say for example when we talk about a particular object, chair, table, door, windows, whatever, object is given to us directly in perception. So our senses could be in direct conjunction, could be in direct touch with the object concerned, and that kind of sense object contact is called Sanyog. It is the most direct kind of sense object contact. So and Sanyog, is generally this kind of relation is generally translated as conjunction, and one of the defining features of Sanyog is that it's a kind of contingent relation between two objects, such that if this kind of relation sort of ceases to exist between the two objects, the nature of the two objects concerned does not change. So say for example, if there are two tables put side by side, they are supposed to bear the relationship of conjunction with each other, such that if one of the table is removed, it doesn't affect the nature of any one of them, as opposed to Samavaya, which is a kind of relationship, which is a kind of relation where if one object, if one of the relata is removed, then it changes the nature of the object concerned, the nature of the object to which it is related. So if one of the relata is removed, or there is a change in that, then there is a concomitant change in the other object also. So Samavaya is known as inherence. So as far as Laukic Pratyaksha is concerned, the very first kind of sense object concourse under the category of Laukic Sannikarsha, under the category of ordinary perception, the first one that is enumerated by Dyotkar and several other other commentators is Sanyog. So Sanyog is generally generally accounts for the direct perception of something, whereas Sanyukta Samavaya is accounts for certain properties of that particular object. Say for example, if we are talking about, as pointed out earlier, whenever we talk about an object, that object comes along with a certain package, comes along with a sort of comes along as a certain package of things, along with certain properties, and which have particular kind of structural sort of complexities, which has certain kind of relationship with the object concerned, and so on and so forth. Some of them are contingent qualities, some of them are essential qualities, and so on. So, Sanyukta Samavai basically refers to the kind of sense-object contact which is responsible for the perception of the qualities or properties associated with an object. And also, sort of mind it that there is a certain kind of, certain kind of schema that we find given in the the object presents itself to us. The same kind of schematic unity, schematic complexity has to be there in the perceptual content as well, and that has to be accounted through different kind of sense object contacts. And this is precisely why there are 6 different kind of sense object contacts that are enumerated in Nyaya philosophy. So, Sanyukta Samavaya basically refers to the kind of sense-object concourse which accounts for the perception of the property of the object which is perceived. So, say for example, the quality of being, if suppose we were talking about, for example, if we were talking about a table, then, and suppose that table were brown, then the property of being brown, so the property of being brown inheres in the object, in the table. So brown is something that inheres, this is not something that you can disassociate, like sort of to things related through sanyog could be sort of separated without affecting the nature of the object concerned. But certain properties inhere within the object, and inherence is a different kind of relation, which is qualitatively different from sanyoga. So, Sanyukta Samavaya refers to the kind of sense-object contact which brings senses into contact with the property which inheres in the object of perception. Say, for example, the property of being brown, the property of being brittle, and so on and so forth. So that kind of, the perception of such kind of quality, guna, that inheres in the object, is accounted for through the relationship of Sanyukta Samavaya in Nyaya theory, which means the senses come into the relationship of sanyog, and then through the relationship of samavaya get sort of associated with the property of the object concerned. So friends, we'll continue our discussion on different kind of sannikarsh or sense object contact when we return after a short break. Thank you.
With this note, thank you so very much for giving us this session on Nyaya Theory of Perception. Dear friends, you are requested to be with us as we are going to be back after a short break, and we promise you to give more and more content. Thank you for watching us. Hello friends, welcome back to this session. Friends, as you know that today we are talking on Nyaya Theory of Perception, and we are trying to give you in-depth knowledge on the topic. And for the discussion we have with us in our studios Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Ajay Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Dr. Verma is a prolific professor, and we believe that you always get in-depth knowledge on various topics and issues through him. Friends, we know that you might have discovered lots of questions through our previous session, and you might be wondering how to get answers. So, if you feel so, you have certain questions, do call us through our toll-free number. Our number is 1800110430. I repeat, our number is 1800110430. Now, I would like to welcome our guest, Dr. Verma, once again. Hello, sir. Welcome to the lecture.
Thank you, Gitika. Welcome back, viewers. So we were talking about the third term that is used in Nyaya definition of perception, which is Sannikarsha, and there as a part of that we discussed that Sannikarsha could be of two kinds. One is Lokik, which means ordinary perception, where there is an actual sense object contact, which basically means that the object of perception is proximate and present, is actually present right before us, and is in proximity, is in actually physical proximity to us. So our senses can be directly in touch with the sense or with the object concerned. Whereas a Lokik kind of sense-object contact refers to a kind of sense-object contact where the actual object of knowledge, meaning the knowledge of whatever we are talking about, is not present before us, and we saw that there could be several examples of that. One being that when we look at the object, we get reminded of certain qualities, certain other qualities that are also associated with that object, and which is responsible for our sort of psychological response towards that particular object, which may generate certain kind of expectation in us, because as I pointed out earlier, perception is a kind of complex phenomena. So, say for example, if we come across certain animals, so though animal at that point of time may not be harming us in certain ways, but we from our past experiences we know that this animal could be potentially dangerous, or this animal really looks is playful and is non-dangerous. So, say for example, we have a very different kind of response towards a pet dog, and we have a very different kind of psychological response to certain other animals, say for example leopard, or say for example a snake. From our past experiences, we know that snake has venom. So now venom is not something that is that we are seeing at that moment, but we know that a particular type of snake, venomous snake, is known to have venom inside it. So, therefore, there are certain things, there are certain features which we know of a particular object, but when we look at that object, we know that those features are associated with that object, even though those are not given to us in perception. So to account for those such kind of cases, like looking at a flower as a fragrant flower, looking at sandalwood as fragrant sandalwood, even though at that very moment we are not being able to smell that particular thing, such cases are accounted for by another kind of sense object concourse, which is known as alokik. So first we'll talk about logic perception, and then later on we'll talk about allokic kinds of sense object concourse. So here we as already discussed, there are 6 kind of sense object concourses enumerated in Nyaya philosophy. And first of them is Sanyog, the second one is Sanyukta Samavaya, third one is Sanyukta Samaveta Samavaya, the fourth one is Samavaya, fifth one is Samveta Samavaya, and the sixth one is Visheshanata. So under that, we have already discussed what kind of sense-object contact does conjunction refer to. Conjunction, is the kind of connection between the sense faculty and an object. So it's a kind of a direct, kind of sense-object contact, whereas in Sanyukta Samavaya, refers to inherence in what is conjoined, something that inheres in what is available to us in perception through the relation of conjunction. So that thing which is conjoined to our sense organ, something that inheres in that object which is conjoined to our sense organ. That kind of sense object concourse is referred to as Sanyukta Samavaya, and it is postulated, it is sort of brought in as a device to explain certain kinds of perception of certain kinds of sort of properties like universal, that is jati, or gunas like properties or action, meaning different kind of kriyas. These are the 3 main features that are associated with these are the 3 different kind of qualities that are generally associated with an object concern. So to account for any perception of anything that could be subsumed under universal property or action, to account for the perception of that, a separate kind of sense object concourse relation is thought of in Nyaya philosophy, and it is called Sanyukta Samavaya. The next kind of connection is called inherence in what inheres in what is conjoined. So whereas Sanyukta Samavaya is the connection between a sense faculty and a property trope which inheres in the object, in inherence in what inheres in what is conjoined, this is called Sanyukta Samaveta Samavaya, which means the connection between a sense faculty and the universal which is instantiated in the property trope, say for example the redness of red. So this is something that we could understand through an example. Say for example, if you're talking about an object, say for example table. Suppose if table were had some kind of small wheels attached to it, then it could be moving. Now movement is a certain kind of property that that in that case would be inhering in the table, or certain other kind of gunas. Say for example it could be brown, as we pointed out earlier. So now the property of being brown is available to us through the sense object concourse, or what is known as Sanyukta Samavaya. But now the property of being red has a universal also, which is redness. So now the redness of the red which is present as a quality, red which is present as a quality, say for example in a table, the universal of that, the redness, is also now available to us, which requires is available to us in perception, which requires a separate different kind of sense object contact to account for, because that universal is not directly available to us in perception the way the table is. So to account for the redness of the quality of red that is instantiated in a given table, which is right present before us, and we are able to see it, our senses are able to get in touch with it through conjunction, and then through the relationship of Sanyukta Samavaya with the red, and then the redness requires one more level of relationship, which is called Sanyukta Samaveta Samavaya. So here there are three different terms associated: redness, which is present in the instantiation of red given in the given object, and the object which is given to us in conjunction. So this is how the redness of the red present in the object concerned is accounted for, this threefold kind of sense object concourse, which is known as Sanyukta Samaveta Samavaya, meaning inherence in what inheres in what is conjoined. So this is and it is this is basically sort of brought in as a device to account for the connection between the sense faculty and the universal, which is instantiated in a property trope, say for example redness of the red or raktatva. Now now the fourth one is inherence. Now, inherence is a special kind of sense object concourse that that is sort of brought in as a tool to explain a very different kind of perception, which is auditory perception. While we were discussing, while we were having a discussion on the very first word, which is Indriyarth Sannikarsha, Indriyarth, there we sort of in our earlier lecture we discussed what is the nature of Indriyas according to Nyaya philosophy, and there we learnt that according to Nyaya philosophy, as a matter of fact, not only Nyaya philosophy, there's something in sort of in different ways, something that is accepted by some other orthodox schools of Indian philosophy as well. There the senses are generally viewed as something physical in nature, and generally it is believed that our senses have the same kind of element sort of towards which they are towards which they are sensitive. So say for example eyes see, eyes don't hear, and ears make us capable of hearing something, and through ears we don't see. That happens because the qualities, the perception of which a particular sense organ is responsible for, it has the same kind of same kind of physical nature as the property which becomes available to us through that sense organ. So now in auditory perception, it is believed that our ears are composed of akash, meaning space, and sound is viewed as property of akash in a Nyaya philosophy, and therefore samavaya is the kind of connection which makes auditory perception possible. So what happens is that in sort of our ears have akash, the property of which is sound. So sound, which could travel through the medium of air, it gets associated with the quality of the akash, which is sort of in a certain way encapsulated, is sort of made limited through our physical sense organ, a physical biological organism. So therefore the perception of sound or auditory perception becomes possible of what inheres in our sense organ. So in auditory perception, our auditory perception, our senses are composed of akash, of which the sound, wherein sound inheres, and therefore the sound becomes perceptible to us. We are able to perceive sound because it inheres it is connected to the sense organ through the relationship of inherence or samavaya. So this is how the relation of samavaya, the sense object concourse, sort of designated as samavaya, is brought in as a device, as a special device to explain the possibility of auditory perception. But here again, once again, like in sort of perception of an ordinary object, we see that the object is given to us, sort of through the relationship of conjunction, and then the color and other qualities are given to us through sanyukta samavaya, and then the property trope or the universal of that given property, like redness of the red present in the table, is given to us through sanyukta samaveta samavaya. Similarly, in the case of sound also, we are able to hear sound because it exists already in our ears as the property of the akasha that is encapsulated in our ears. But sound also has the soundness, a kind of a property trope of itself, kind of universality about itself. So to account for the perception of the universal soundness, another sense object relation is brought in by the Nyayikas, and this is called samveta samavaya, which is defined as inherence in what inheres. So sound is something that inheres in ears, in the sense organ, and what inheres in what inheres, meaning the soundness which inheres in the sound, and sound which inheres in the akasha, which our ears represent. So samvet samavaya is brought in to account for the soundness, the universal of sound. So inherence in what inherence, that is samvet samavaya, is the connection between the auditory faculty and the universals which inhere within sounds, which inhere in ether, that is akash. The relation between the soundness and ear is therefore known as samaveta samavaya. For example, in the auditory perception of soundness, the sense organ ear is in contact with the object soundness because it inheres in sound, which on its part inheres as a quality in the ear. According to Nyayikas, words are non-eternal. We must understand here that according to Nyayikas, words are non-eternal because words are something that is produced. This is in contrast to Mimamsaka's view of words, according to whom words are eternal, they are apaurishe, and sort of empirical words are only instantiations of the universal words which are all the time there, eternal. So, according to Nyayikas, words are non-eternal, words are sound with a meaning, and sound is a physical phenomena. Sound is considered by them as an attribute, as a property of akasha. Akasha, in turn, is an intangible and an pervading substance. It is transmitted from one place to another through the medium of air. Sound, since it is not non-produced, meaning it is produced. Something that is not produced could be eternal. But since it is produced, therefore it is not eternal. This is the argument that is offered for non-eternality of sound, as against Mimamsakas, for whom the sound is eternal. So sound, since it is not produced, is non-eternal, and hence is subject to origin and decay. It comes into being and ceases to exist too. It is produced either as a result of quick conjunction of two different bodies or disjunction of the part of one composite body. So when we clap, two objects, two hands come together and produce sound. At times, when something is broken off from something, as a result of that kind of disjunction, some kind of sound could be produced. So now the last one in line is something called as visheshanata. which basically means qualifier, qualified relation. Visheshya Visheshanata Bhav refers to connection which allows for perception of inherence and absence in objects. In all cases, the perceptual cognition is born of connection between sense faculty and an occurrent fact or object, including perception of absences. So this sixth kind of sense-object contact, which is known as Visheshanata, is a special, it is thought of as a special kind of a sense-object contact which accounts for the perception of absence of something. Now, absence is a very different kind of a queer case for any realist, because we know things to be absent. We know that we are not only aware of presence of something, but we are also very often aware of absences of things. So, since we have knowledge of absence of things, it needs to be accounted for. Through what pramana do we have the we know the absence of something? Now, very interestingly, Nayayikas believe that absences are actually seen, and to account for that, they think of absence as given to us through the relationship of Visheshanata. It's a qualifying distinct property that is associated with something that is present. So there could be a table present before us, but it may have a distinctive quality that something may be absent on it. So we are able to see, say for example, absence of a bottle of water on table because that absence is associated as a special quality, as Visheshanata, of the object which is directly given to us in perception. So we see the absence of something as a special property associated with the object that we are able to perceive. So friends, in this lecture we looked at what is meant by Sannikarsha in the Nyaya definition of perception. In our earlier lecture we looked at what kind of realism do Nyaya philosophers believe in, and accordingly what according to them should be the nature of indriyas and the nature of artha. Today's lecture we sort of looked at how different properties are and their perception through and their knowledge through perception is accounted for through different kind of sense object contacts, the word for which is Sannikarsha in the definition of perception given by Nayayikas. There are other three words which we find occurring in the definition. We'll talk about them in our forthcoming lectures. So that's all from this end for today's lecture.
Well, thank you, sir. Thank you so very much for giving us this session on Nyaya Theory of Perception. Dear friends, we believe that your feedbacks and your questions are very, very important for us. So do write to us at info.cec@nic.in. Here you can post your questions as well as your feedback, as well as if you feel so that you need to have a session on a particular topic, then also you can write to us. We are taking your leave with the promise that we are going to meet again soon. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, sir. Thank you once again.